Descendant, graduate student in theology at Baylor University. Her work explores questions of Indigenous identity, race, and belonging at the intersection of theology, history, and social theory. This current project reflects her growing interest in how colonial legal structures, such as blood quantum, continue to shape Native communities and their narratives of peoplehood. Megan is interested in methods that bring Indigenous perspectives into conversation with Christian theology, especially around issues of land, kinship, and community formation. She hopes for her scholarship to support conversations that strengthen Indigenous sovereignty and cultural continuity. Outside of her studies, Megan enjoys writing, gardening, canning salsa and pickles with her grandmother, and spending time with her husband, no kids yet, Jaron and French, her husband Jaron, and the French bulldog Rosie. So Megan, please come and share your presentation.
Is it working?
Oh, thank you for being here to present Indigenous knowledge, and it always comes from the heart. So I can just do this side, closer to you.
Do you want to bring this down a little or no? Okay. Awesome. Tuskani do usha mapsitare shineto ush mini hanita shineto ush nueta iruha mirase mute tawahi nuhike ehenito ush Mashi Iruha Mirase, Megan Burr-Joslin, Ehedi To'osh. Baylor University Graduate Program of Religion and Theology and Ethics, Set Oharani Wahuni To'osh. Waco, Texas, Set Mama Kanit Tosh. What I just said is, how's it going, everyone? Good day, it's good to see you all. My name in Nueta is Mute Tawahi Nuhike. My name in English is Megan Burr-Joslin. My mom's name is Lori Burr. My dad's name is Larry Burr Jr. I come here from Baylor University's graduate program in theology and ethics, and I live in Waco, Texas. I am from the Mandan Hidatsa Rikara tribe on Fort Berthold, and I'm a child of Knife Clan. And in my upbringing, I was taught that these introductions are some of the most important things about ourselves when we talk to people, when we introduce ourselves. And it's an important piece of my identity and who I am in relationship with, and honoring those relationships with responsibility, participation, and acknowledgement. I know many of you in this room understand this relationality as it is essential to who we are. When I first read my tribe's enrollment, however, I was struck by how its language seemed so contrary to that understanding, so contrary to what my grandfather taught me about being Mandan. I'm always introduced to my relatives using language of the immediate family, and those in Knife Clan are understood in the same way. My grandmother's mother is still my mother, my grandmother. My cousins are my brothers and sisters. And growing up, and even now, kinship feels abundant, expansive, and an ever-growing and inclusive web of relations where everyone belongs. But reading the ordinance, I find myself asking what happened, that my understanding of relationship halts abruptly when it comes to this idea of official, federally recognized membership. What happened that my understanding of relationship became simultaneously measured by how much blood I share with my family? Who took hold of our people's stories and redefined belonging in terms of fractions? How is it that my future children might no longer be eligible to be recognized because they don't hold a piece of plastic in their pocket? They can't be Mandan or children of Knife Clan simply because someone decided they're not Native enough. These questions led me to look deeper into blood quantum legislation within my tribe's enrollment ordinance, a policy that is common to many tribal nations in the United States. And due to my own experience as an American, my project focuses more on my own tribe's enrollment ordinance and similar experiences in the United States. But I invite my other Indigenous brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers. I want you to be a part of this broader conversation outside of the lens of the United States legislation if you experience otherwise. Your story is welcome here too. Blood quantum for Americans, it's a system that measures Native identity through fractions of ancestry. For example, someone like myself might be described as 1/2, 1/4, or 1/8 Native. Nothing about these systems are neutral in describing ancestry, and they turn ancestry into legal measurements of belonging. They ask, how much Native blood do you have? And that also translates into how I meet most people. I say, I'm Indigenous, and they're like, oh, how much? I don't say, how much Irish are you, or how much, yeah, you know the bit. It often decides what rights, recognition, or access you have to as well, to communal resources, money-based grants, and it's based on that calculation. And that is a very different way of understanding peoplehood than one grounded in kinship, responsibility, community, and responsibility. However, in all of these claims, I am not saying that Native nations are foolish or wrong for worrying about enrollment, for worrying about resources, fraud, land, sovereignty, or the future of our people. I think those concerns are very real. Native nations have had to make decisions under intense colonial pressure, limited resources, and federal interference. So this paper, I don't reject tribal sovereignty, but I am asking a different question. What kind of logic have Native nations inherited when belonging must be measured by fractions of blood? My answer is that blood quantum reflects a logic of scarcity. But additionally, not only is this a logic of scarcity, but scarcity is literally a byproduct of tribes like the MHA, and when I say the MHA, I mean Mandan, Hidatsa, Rikara people, who have submitted themselves to the system of the settler state. By scarcity, I mean the belief that there is not enough to go around. Not enough identity, not enough resources, not enough recognition, not enough belonging, not enough future. The MHA enrollment ordinance, like other tribal legislations, has felt pressure to recognize Native identity as finite, fragile, and exhaustible, requiring tight control through documentation, verification, and blood measurement. 4 assumptions define the scarcity logic. Indigeneity is a limited resource that can disappear. Identity is fragile, and by that I mean belonging can be diluted or compromised. Or compromise. Therefore, the assumption is that control is required. It's essential that this belonging must be tightly regulated. And finally, this loss justifies exclusion. The threat of extinction legitimizes restrictive procedures. So not only are these assumptions contributing to a rhetoric of scarcity, but as tribes like the MHA use blood quantum and have adopted it themselves, the story of scarcity becomes the reality. Blood quantum becomes one way of managing the fear that is accumulated from colonial domination, but it comes at the cost of abundance and belonging on our own terms. For the 3 affiliated tribes, the logic is best understood when reading the ordinance's purpose statements, and scarcity shows up most clearly in the language of protection. It says specifically in Article 11, Section 2, that its purpose is to, and I quote, preserve the viability and integrity of tribal membership. To, I quote again, strengthen independence and sovereignty. To protect the rights of future members. And it's performed through non-biased determination. That one always kills me. On one level, this language makes a lot of sense. If we're trying to protect something, this language of protection we have to use. Of course, a tribal nation wants to protect its people. Of course, it wants to preserve sovereignty. Of course, it wants to make sure enrollment is fair and not fraudulent. But it is essential to look deeper into what that language assumes. When the ordinances say membership must be preserved, it suggests that identity is vulnerable. When it speaks of integrity, it suggests that membership can be diluted or compromised. When it speaks of protecting future members, it can imply that new members threaten the resources of rights of those already enrolled. So the question becomes, what if the ordinance is not only about protecting our belonging? What if it is also teaching us to treat one another with suspicion, skepticism, and exclusivity? This logic also appears in the ordinance's procedures around disenrollment. The ordinance allows challenges to a person's enrollment. It provides procedures for removing someone from the tribe if they are accused of being enrolled through fraud or error. Again, I think we can all agree no one wants fraudulent enrollment, but I believe that concern is legitimate, but also the larger structure creates this posture of suspicion. Belonging becomes something that has to be proven, it has to be verified, documented, analyzed, it has to be on a plastic rectangle that we can see and feel with our hands. Therefore, instead of starting with relationship, the system starts with doubt. And that is one of the emotional and spiritual costs of blood quantum. It can make Native people endure a constant watchful eye of suspicion, not only from the settler state, but from our relatives themselves. And we are always being measured, we're always being questioned, and always needing to prove that we belong. The same logic appears in restrictions concerning if you find yourselves descending from multiple tribes. If someone has ties to more than one tribe, they are more than likely, and in the case with my tribe's enrollment ordinance procedures, they are forced to choose one or the other. But many Native people have complex family histories. Amen. People can descend from, relate to, or carry responsibilities to more than one people. Blood quantum and enrollment law flatten that complexity. They make belonging singular, exclusive, and bureaucratic. That may be administratively convenient, might be easier to type up on a Word document, but it doesn't reflect the reality of Native kinship and communal relationships. None of this was ever meant for us. It was meant for the benefit of the federal government and the capitalist system. So you might be asking, Megan, where the heck does this come from? And I'm so sorry, this will not all fit. The picture's cool, we'll leave it with that. Where did this come from? The reason I call blood quantum a colonial system is that it did not begin as traditional indigenous ways of understanding belonging. It developed through US federal Indian policy. Policies like allotment, the Dawes Act, the Burke Act, and later IRA-era constitutions helped turn Native identity into something the federal government could measure, manage, and reduce. And for the sake of time, I can't go through each of these eras, but if you end up going deeper into the journal, I do talk about these eras in more depth. Blood quantum became tied to land in the sense of private property, citizenship, our competency based off if you're 50% Native, you might not be smart enough to own your own land, inheritance, and access to resources. In other words, the government didn't simply measure Native identity, but it created a system where Native identity could be administratively erased over time, like a backspace on a keyboard. That is why blood quantum is so dangerous. It can slowly define Native people out of existence. In my paper, I primarily engage with Jonathan Tran's account of racial capitalism to help explain this. And racial capitalism, for those of you who don't know, and I didn't know until I wrote this paper, is a way of describing how race and economics work together in a way that distributes wealth, land, resources, and recognition unequally. I know that's right. Tran argues racial capitalism, and I quote, focuses attention on the ideological surface, all the while extracting value from that which lies beneath. Blood quantum fits into that system because it turns Native identity into something countable, limited, and rationed. It makes scarcity feel like the natural outcome of indigeneity, of being non-white. It tells Native communities that there is not enough to sustain them. Yet Senator Wheeler's 1934 remark during IRA debates reveals the true intent, and I quote, "What we are trying to do is get rid of the Indian problem rather than add to it." End quote. To explain how blood quantum can appear protective while still causing harm, I also want to briefly bring in Jonathan Tran's discussion of the model minority myth. The MMM is the idea that Asian Americans are unusually successful, hardworking, high-achieving, and able to overcome racism through discipline and family values. On the surface, that sounds super positive. But Tran argues that the myth is not actually protective, it's a racial capitalist story. It makes one group appear successful in order to hide deeper systems of racial and economic inequality. It also turns communities against one another by suggesting that if one group can succeed, then other marginalized groups must be responsible for their own suffering. In other words, the myth praises Asian Americans while still using them. Shocker, we are used. That is parallel with what I want to draw with blood quantum. Blood quantum can appear protective, but it can sound like a way to guard culture, protect sovereignty, prevent fraud, and preserve resources for future generations. The connection is not that Asian Americans' experiences are the same as Native experiences and in other Indigenous experiences. They aren't. But the connection is that racial capitalism often works by making harmful systems look reasonable, protective, or even beneficial. The model minority myth says, this group is successful because the system works. And blood quantum says, this nation will survive if belonging is tightly controlled. And when people believe those things, new relatives start to look like threats. They start to look like competition, and I think that's the tragedy in all of this. Our relatives aren't the danger. I don't think they ever have been. But the colonial system makes us feel like belonging and survival have to compete with each other. My uncle painted this, so love you, uncle. I'm going to keep you right there. You guys will hear me talk about everything on that slide. For me, this question is not only economic or political, but it's deeply theological and resonates with my spirituality. Many Indigenous traditions understand life through relationship. We belong to one another, to land, to ancestors, to the circle of responsibility that surrounds us. We belong to the future generations and the more than human world. Patty Krawick writes about becoming kin and expanding this circle of responsibility. That vision deeply challenges the idea that belonging is a scarce substance that has to be measured and rationed. In the Arikara creation story, one of the tribes, a part of the 3 affiliated tribes that I'm with, living beings emerge together from Mother Earth. The world begins not with isolated individuals, but with shared origin and relationship. And I think the story gives us a very different vision, a very different imagination. It doesn't begin with scarcity, it begins with life held together. And I also want to acknowledge that this whole argument, a lot of people defend blood quantum. This whole argument would be disagreed with by some members of my tribe who I also respect in this conversation. Many Native people defend blood quantum because they are trying to protect their nations, and we have to acknowledge that and know that that's real. They worry about outsiders claiming identity falsely. We all know what that's like. They worry about limited housing, healthcare, the education of their children, per capita payments, land, political rights. They worry about cultural continuities, and I don't think those fears can be dismissed or we're doing something wrong. But my argument is that blood quantum may appear to protect those fears and the sovereignty of Native nations, but it's ultimately participating in the very colonial logic that threatens them. It promises protection, but it often does so by shrinking the people. It protects the future by narrowing who can belong to it. So that is the contradiction I'm trying to name. So what might an alternative look like? There's some hope in this, don't you worry. I'm not pretending to offer a complete political solution in a 50-page law thing, because I genuinely would need to do like another 10 years of school to even start that. But I understand that enrollment law is complicated, and each tribal nation has the sovereign right to determine its own citizenship. So even when I promote these things, I also want to know I am not speaking for every tribe, because I don't have all of their experiences as my own. I do want to suggest a different vision. Instead of grounding citizenship primarily in blood quantum, we might think in terms of relational citizenship. And relational citizenship would ask questions like, who are your people? Who are you in relationship with? What responsibilities do you carry? How are you accountable to the nation? How are you connected through descent, kinship, adoption, community participation, land, story, and obligation? And I don't think that means that anyone can belong. I think it means belonging isn't reducible to a fraction. And it means citizenship should be connected to relationship, responsibility, accountability, not only biology, which in another paper I could talk about how is a total myth to begin with. So economic accountability. Talking about economic accountability, I think relational citizenship cannot ignore the material reality. We all need money. We can't avoid that. Many people fear expanded enrollment because resources are already limited. Let me remind you, it's not just scarcity logic, it also is scarcity. So any conversation about moving beyond blood quantum also has to include economic accountability. If people are afraid that new members will take away benefits, then the issue is not only identity, it's also governance, distribution, transparency, debt, resource management, and trust. That means tribes need strong forms of accountability. They need clear public budgets. They need independent audits. They need conflict of interest rules, anti-nepotism protections, fair appeal, that one will be interesting, fair appeals processes, and citizen oversight. I don't think these things weaken sovereignty. I think they can be expressions of sovereignty, but a nation is not less sovereign because it is accountable to its own people. And I think we've missed that. It is more fully living into sovereignty when its institutions serve the people with honesty and care. So this paper asks us to consider two visions of peoplehood. One vision says Native identity is fragile, finite, and must be protected through measurement, like I have discussed. The other says peoplehood is sustained through relationship, responsibility, memory, land, accountability. And I think blood quantum belongs to that first vision. It teaches Native people to survive shrinking. But I believe our future should not depend on measuring blood. It should depend on rebuilding the relationship and institutions that allow our nations to live in greater abundance, honesty, and responsibility. The question is not only who has enough blood to belong. I think the deeper question is, what kind of people are we becoming when belonging is governed by fractions? And what would it take to imagine a future where our nations do not have to preserve themselves by measuring themselves out of existence? And I invite in our conversations as well, and Uncle Adrian, you can offer whatever questions you want to as well. I think you'll have a lot of wisdom to share on this topic. But what does blood quantum have to do with being a good ancestor? Thank you.
You got a few whistles. I have my status card, and I expire January 31st, 2030. That must be the apocalypse. Wasn't there 2030 in climate issues?
Got your targets picked out?
I appreciate the whole paper, and in the journal it'll be excellent to be able to read the whole paper and to understand what Tran was saying about racial capitalism too. That was an interesting kind of perspective on this as well. I lived in Oklahoma for a while, a couple of times, and I had a Cherokee friend. His name was Joe Sunday, and he was 31/32nd Cherokee. Not sure how you get 31/32, but that's what he was. And it was real interesting. He showed me his card. You know, as long as I have been in NAITS, I have never asked anybody for their papers. There are people right now that are looking at people's papers. And the spirit of that, you know, there's some accountability they want to bring to it, but the spirit of it is not gracious, and it's not what I know as Nate's person or the Jesus that I understand as well. So identity politics is really a hot topic. And at the beginning place in NAITS, NAITS.com, we put together a paper. I called it a small treatise on Indigenous identity. And we talked about what is Nate's view of that whole world of, you know, exposing pretendians and all of that. And so it would be good for you to read that and be able to see that we've invested our time into thinking about these things. And so Megan has really touched a number of things that are really important to think about. And her context is the United States. It's the same thing in Canada. Even though my card doesn't have a blood quantum number on it, in the rules, the blood quantum numbers are there in Canada. And my own grandchildren, who are quarter blood, cannot be registered as Indian in Canada, status Indian. It's illegal. And they're just making a rule change now that will return that possibility. But anyways, that's the reality. We live with this. And the purpose of I read a good book in a book that, or in a course that was talking about the idea of colonialism and decolonialism. Brian Burkhart wrote a book called Indigenizing Philosophy Through the Land. And he used this a trickster methodology for decolonizing environmental ethics and indigenous futures. And in that book, he talked about the fact that when it came to blood quantum, one drop of white blood to indigenous people put you on the journey to extinction. Because the whole purpose is to eventually get it so low that it's irrelevant. And there are no more Indians. Why? Because then there's no competing interest to the land. In Canada, we have connection through treaty to the land. And the only way for the colonial system to get our land is to disappear us. So that's the purpose of blood quantum, ultimately. So people that are, trying to look through blood quantum to determine legitimacy, it just says you're on the wrong track. And then he also said that one drop of black blood made you black.
Yep.
In order to keep the slave population going to feed the colonial project. So the colonial project does not care about indigenous people or black people. The colonial project does not care. And it is doing what it can for its own self-purposes. And so I'm not interested in any kind of appeal to that. And I really appreciate the fact that she suggested this kind of future going forward. And she mentioned indigenous sovereignty. We all have our own rules. Before, with Haudenosaunee people, you are what your mother is. So if your father's Mohawk but your mother's Cayuga, you are Cayuga. If your mother is Turtle Clan, you are Turtle Clan. That's who I am. And that's a matrilineal descent. The colonial system is patrilineal descent. So father and all of that. And that messes you up royally. Because then you, not only do you have identity, you have responsibilities. And some cultures utilize both clans, father's clan and mother's clans, in their identity. Navajo do that. But also Gitxsan in northern BC, they have father's clan and mother's clan. And there are responsibilities that are associated with the clans. So in order to know who you are, you need to know those things, because then it tells you what your responsibilities are. But it's up to each nation to make a determination on their own. Now, with Seneca people in Western New York, they're Haudenosaunee, they have the traditional rule, you are what your mother is. And so, if you are born to a Seneca mother, you are Seneca. No half, no quarter, no 3/4, no 7/8, nothing like that.
Right.
You're Seneca. If your mother is not Seneca, you are Seneca descendant, so you can claim that term, but you have no, legal rights or anything. You probably live in the community, but you don't have any kind of legal rights. Well, that's how they've decided to deal with it. Haudenosaunee also had adoption, which was a citizenship-making idea. In citizenship, in the United States, you're either an American or you're not, or you're on some stage of becoming an American. And in Canada, it's the same thing. There's a point at which you become a Canadian citizen. There's no such thing as a half Canadian. 3/4 Canadian, 7/8 Canadian. So but that serves their purpose. So that's how they run the rules. What about us serving our purpose and doing it by our way? And so I really appreciate the fact that she talked about that future as well, because that's what we really need to be, going forward. And for me, the colonial system really messed us up when it comes to identity, and we need to, realize that being a part of that system is being a part of that messed up world. And we need to really restore our own ways of doing things. Now, we have, we're done at 45, right? So we've got time for questions. So did you posed a question? How do you want to deal with that? Do you want to just get people to respond?
Sure, or if you have questions too, either one.
Okay.
Whatever you feel. I'm not going to tightly control you.
Could you help our minds, though?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
Remind us of that same
Yeah.
question.
I think one of the main questions I think would be in resonating with the theme of the symposium is something that when I was originally writing this paper, I wasn't thinking about enough. And I think that's something that would be cool to and essential to contribute to this paper is what do you all think blood quantum has to do with being a good ancestor?
Any responses to that?
Yeah.
Anybody have some thoughts about that? Or even questions beyond that? Okay, over here.
Hi, just want to say thank you so much for the great presentation. I'm from Cape Town in South Africa, so very different context, but indigeneity outside is really contested as well. We don't have anything like blood quantum or anything like that, but just in response to the idea of like, when I think of my ancestors, I have very mixed origins now that have like very mixed ancestry, and I don't really think of blood as much as blood is beautiful and it's flowing inside of me, but I think of ancestors. So I will think of, even if it's 5 generations back, I won't think of, oh, okay, that makes me a 1/16th or this or that. Or to be honest as well, we have so much like Eurasia in our stories and ancestries like that, so it's actually impossible to do that. You take a genetics test to have that. Besides that, you can't really. So instead of me being like, oh no, 1/16th of my blood is this or that, I'm like, there's a human who existed, who walked the earth as an indigenous person with stories and interacting with the world, and to me that is what is so sacred. Because what I also thought about at some stage was, that's not just one human. That human came from other humans who came from other humans. So even if, whether I'm going back 50 years or whether I'm going back 500 years, it's kind of irrelevant. I just think of the fact that it's humans, sacred, beautiful humans created in God's image, which I don't think can really be quantified in like how much blood is inside. So I just wanted to share. In terms of the ancestral thing, that's what I think about.
Thank you for sharing that.
One thing that I could add is that there is self-identification, which is what you think, and then there is a people identification. In North America, we have nations, indigenous nations, and it's our nations that collectively decide who we are as peoples. And we have our own rules, just like Canada has its own rules for citizenship. And that's, we talk more in terms of citizenship than we do membership in a tribe. It's the idea of this is the Cayuga Nation, and this is who makes up the Cayuga Nation, and these are the rules, just like citizenship for any other nation. So there's two different things, like I have an Irish ancestor too. So I have an affinity to Ireland, but I don't claim to be Irish citizen. I just say I recognize that dimension of my heritage. But I am Cayuga because I fit the rules for all that is necessary to be Cayuga.
And if I want to speak on that, I watched something yesterday doing the dancing. So I'm writer for Métis from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and so the whole, if you don't know what Métis are, is basically the idea of like First Nations and European come together. There's like a few different stories of how our people came to be. One of them is what's the Latin term for it? It's like the kind of like breed them out of existence, but it kind of backfired on the colonials, and now we got the Solomon group of people that rebelled against Canada. And And it's very much been a thing since like very early on in my people's history that we don't have this blood quantum that you are Métis or you are not. And there's like a wide range of what a Métis person looks like. Like, look at me, I look very European, and I have like cousins who look very vicious, and that doesn't match to us at all. And that's how that's just areas that we are accepted in this grand community to hold on to us. And it's been in the way of like of my indigenous government, the National Métis Federation, like disbanded this blood quantum thing. That like, as long as you can trace your heritage back to the Red River settlement before 1870, you're a Métis. No matter like this could be like 2,000 years from now, but you're still gonna be Métis. That's the only way I like how my tradition, my people do it, and how they talk to like, how I will be an ancestor, my ancestors very much.
Thank you.
For my people, the idea, especially when I'm working with younger adults and things and kids, the whole quest of identity gets completely messed up when they have to look at it this way, because they're really focused on wanting to do cultural recovery, and that's like huge in their identity. So for many of them, they've had to just kind of set that aside, the whole question of blood quantum aside, and not allow it to define them, either from tribal people or from government, because they just want to focus on recovery, cultural recovery and learning, and taking the responsibility for the continuation of life ways. And not only tribal people don't always appreciate that, and government doesn't care.
I also wanted to speak in a little to just the story about non-Indigenous inclusion into tribes. My Magoo, my grandma Rita Burr, she married my grandfather, who is Mandan descent. Our fourth great-grandfather was the last chief of our tribe, Chief Forebears, and she wasn't Indigenous. And one of the things that has always inspired me most is I've actually learned the most about my indigeneity from her. And she ended up being adopted into Knife Clan and has quickly and also slowly, like just throughout her life, quickly become the matriarch of our tribe and the glue of our family in our ways and our relationships to one another. If anything's out of balance, she brings it back into balance, and she knows our ways, and she knows that my ribbon skirt seems a little off. But she is in my head a prime example of a counter story to blood quantum, because there's no card in her pocket, but nobody would argue that she's Indigenous through how she is with our tribe.
And I've consulted vegan grandmas who say that their tribe isn't going to recognize their grandchildren, but it's their eyes, they're fully Indigenous because they're running their life ways and they're fully involved in life.
Over here.
Yeah, so thank you again. It's definitely it is a hot topic and a lot of layers, and I appreciate you kind of having a conversation. Brian's my cousin, actually, so it's kind of fun to hear you, if you're going to bring him up. Great guy. But that is, so, I'm Cherokee Nation and linear descent, but we also have two bands that don't practice linear descent. And it definitely gets complex in that one, because we also have a lot of people who are self-identifying as us. That makes us difficult as well. And so trying to figure that out. And then the complexity of, my oldest son is adopted, non-native. And it's like, I really want to bring him in. And when I go to our traditional dances, and I'm part of the Katua Nighthawks kind of stomp ground, is we have one of the guys there that our chief had befriended. He's in his early 20s, and he's been learning the language and speaks it like almost fluent and knows the dances and songs, no native heritage whatsoever. But he has found complete life in our ceremonies and practices, and he's always respectful. And he recently just married a Cherokee woman and now has a Cherokee child. And that's sitting there, and that challenges me on another level, because you're just like, wait a minute, And so there is those identities or things or places, and you kind of wish that the colonial mindset would go away, because I really wish I could have adoption again, you know, for my own son, for this gentleman, areas where we as a nation could be able to bring in and work for, so we could be those good ancestors. Because at the same time, you, at least for my areas, I want the Cherokee Nation to exist in 100 years. And that means we have to have some kind of sovereignty. And that means there has to be some kind of citizenship. Because if you do away with citizenship, then you do away with the sovereignty. In our particular world that we live in, there's almost a fight for that as well. And so I don't have any answers, but it is, I appreciate the questions, and I think a good ancestor is, if I have any deal, is to be a good ancestor is to wrestle through these questions instead of punting them or not answering them, because I think that's almost more harm to our children and grandchildren, is that we don't provide them with the structure to be able to process through that. So we who are here in this room today, who have the money to come, the intellects to show up, we need to do the hard work to wrestle through so that our 7 generations below us can be able to know how to process and hopefully do a better job of answering that question. But if we ignore it, then I feel we're being a bad ancestor.
Yeah, and who is Cherokee? It's a Cherokee answer to, it's their question to answer. Not mine, not the outsider, it's the Cherokee.
In fact, go back to Brian, because actually, my father is one of the ones, his generation, he kind of gave up on trying to fight. He's non-confrontational. So he told my brother and I, just click white and go on. Don't do it. Even though we grew up in the Cherokee Res, all that kind of stuff. And I started asking questions. I went to Brian, and one of Brian's questions, he's like, who claims you? He said, get out of your head, stop being a self, and who claims you? Who are your people? And he really was huge on that, because I started looking around going, wow, I actually have a people who claim me. And I could trace my lineage, my family, all that stuff. I could go Pauline on you and well, but it's like it gets out of myself and back on the people. Like I said, it is our question to ask, and all of our people groups to ask, wherever that may be. And we just have to do the hard work.
I am a Métis person myself, and then this really resonates with me because there's a whole lot of denialism in my family, and with the 60 Scoop and the script and so forth, there's just a lot of shame that has been on our shoulders, and so we kind of like have hidden ourselves so that we're able to kind of like avoid some of those challenges, but there's been a resurgence, and I'm trying to figure everything out, and I have limited resources, but I have people who are elders who are in my life. I have truth tellers. I have people that are who know are part of our story and so forth. And I just think that there needs to continue to be like a good level of good education, and then the ones that are available to us to share those stories so that we are able to continue that conversation with the future generations, because it's got to stop somewhere. And I wonder if this is the place where it's to stop, and it's our responsibility to carry it forward.
We have sharing circles where more questions and conversation can happen. We're at the end of our time together, so wanted to make sure that we give you your gift, and thank you for helping us out today. It was really good.